fire philosophy, Nietzsche, Zen, and how to live.
Welcome, everyone. I'm glad to have you here. We're extremely pleased today to have as our guest on Fire Philosophy, Stephen Batchelor, a Scot, and one of the world's leading teachers, writers, thinkers in the domain of contemporary Buddhism, and also someone internationally known for his reflections on the central question that we have in fire philosophy, which is basically how to live well or authentically in a world that's constantly changing and uncertain and precarious. It's been Stephen's theme for many years, and it really has forcefully come out in a new book that we want to feature. Biographically, after attending school in the small English town of Watford, Stephen traveled overland from England to India in 1971 as a somewhat clueless 18-year-old, but with good instincts, somehow found his way to Dharamsala, at that time, the focal point as Tibetan Buddhism and new home of the Dalai Lama. He was soon thereafter ordained as a novice monk in 1972, and then a few years later receiving full ordination. After 10 years studying and working in prominent positions in the Tibetan tradition of Buddhism, Stephen moved to Korea to practice Zen Buddhism. There he met Martine, a French Zen nun, and after many years of Zen study together, they left monastic life to be married. For the last quarter of a century, they've lived in a French village near Bordeaux. That is when they're not traveling around the world to lecture and lead meditation retreats. So I can't begin to summarize. I won't try all the positions of importance Stephen's held, his accomplishments. But from my point of view, and what's influenced me the most, are his publications. Really, a dozen groundbreaking works have had an enormous impact on contemporary global Buddhism. As a longtime fan of Stephen's intellectual and contemplative insights, an admirer of his life practice, and a friend, I'm really pleased that he's here today to talk to us. His new book is called Buddha, Socrates, and Us, Ethical Living in Uncertain Times. It's coming out very shortly from Yale University Press. Krzysztof and I had the privilege of an advanced reading, and we recommend it with great enthusiasm. It's yet another Batchelor tour de force. Welcome, Stephen.
Thank you very much, Dale.
I want to have a copy of the book. Could you show the book cover? You've got one. We don't.
Okay, I've got one just to hand, actually. So here it is. Is that filling the screen properly?
That's filling it perfectly. Beautiful.
Yeah.
Sun symbol.
We had a long struggle with the cover. And this one, I think, is by far the best of all the options we had.
No, it's beautiful. Stephen's in Southwest France. Krzysztof is in Sicily. I'm in California, but what an incredible world we live in. Here we are. So, Stephen, can you just start us off and get us going? Describe what inspired this book and what's the primary thesis?
I think probably what inspired this book in the most literal terms is the COVID lockdown. Suddenly, like all of us, I found myself at home for an unspecified duration and the inability to go anywhere else. And so my whole way of life sort of ground to a halt. I no longer had to write a bit, study a bit, then jump on a plane for all that stuff. And I used that as an opportunity to deepen my understanding of the Greek philosophical tradition. As you probably know, at least you probably have picked up, that I've been interested in Hellenistic philosophy for quite some years now. And I've written a bit on Pyrrho. I've written a little bit on Stoicism, I think. And I found that extraordinarily rich encounter, going back to the roots of my own tradition and finding therein elements that were very compatible, sometimes weirdly compatible, particularly with early Buddhism. But in the COVID lockdown, I had the opportunity, for the first time, I find rather embarrassed to say, I started to read Plato. Now, of course, over the years, I'd been aware of the parable of the cave. I had some rough idea of that world, but I never really sat down and carefully gone through some of Plato's Socratic dialogues in particular. I was already at that point on my way with another book, some of which is still found in this final version. Some chapters are from there, and that predated COVID, where I wanted to write an autobiography of my own philosophical journey through Buddhism, which I've always wanted to do, and I've never really had the time or the opportunity to really go through it step by step. So that continues to be one thread of this book, Buddha, Socrates, and Us. And initially I thought it would be really good to have a chapter on Socrates in this book. But the more I looked into Plato and the more I tried to figure out how would I do that, I began to realize that it wouldn't be a chapter, it would be another thread within the whole book. And in fact, the Socrates thread is now, I think, the thread that holds the whole thing together. It's the kind of the binding agent. And I think what really gave me the clue to the book itself, as it now is, was a meditation retreat I did at the end of 2020 by myself in a nearby Buddhist center. And that's when I suddenly realized how not only would I need to focus on Socrates and the dialogues, but also on Greek theatre. The question really being, how did the ancient Greeks address the question of suffering, which is arguably the preeminent starting point for the whole Buddhist endeavor? And yet Plato doesn't talk about suffering at all, or once, I think it's mentioned. It occurred to me then that if I had been an Indian and a student of the Buddha in his early years of teaching, and if by some reason I then found myself all the way over in the West, in the city of Athens, how would I have understood how this community, which clearly had very deep philosophical inquiry going on, how would it have addressed the issue of suffering? And then it struck me that, kind of obviously really, it would have been through tragic drama. In other words, the tragedies that were performed regularly in Athens and elsewhere in Greece at that period. Then my next question was, what did Socrates have to do with tragic drama? And the answer comes in the text on Socrates that we find in Diogenes Laertius, 3rd century AD Greek writer about whom we don't know nothing, who, for some reason, his summary of 80 Greek philosophers that he had access to at that time were all compiled in one volume. And the entry on Socrates, after having given Socrates his name and his parents and where he was born, he then says, and Socrates was renowned for having collaborated with Euripides. Now, that was the link, basically, that enabled me to imagine myself as a hypothetical Buddhist in Athens in the 5th century BC, at the same time while the Buddha was still alive in India, and to be able to then use that literary conceit or device as a means to somehow pull these various threads together. It's difficult to say what the thesis of the book is, to be quite honest. It is superficially a comparative study of two contemporaries, the Buddha, who was the fount of, it had an enormous impact on the whole of Asian civilization, and Socrates, the Greek, in Athens, who had a comparable effect on the emergence of Western civilization. So you have these two figures, both alive at the same time. They clearly didn't know about each other, and yet I found increasingly resonances between them. Of course, this depends on how you read the Buddha, and in my previous books, I spent a lot of time trying to uncover the human figure of the Buddha, which is a challenging task. But nonetheless, I think one can get a clearer idea by a close reading of early Pali texts. And so I don't need to go into all of that again in this book, but it means I already have a clear idea of the Buddha as a person, which makes it much easier to compare him with Socrates, who comes across very much as a flesh and blood human being in the writings of Plato and, of course, of Xenophon, and to some extent through Aristophanes. So that, as it were, is what set the stage for this project. But I think my real thesis is not to do a historical comparison, which is frankly not really my forte. I'm not a historian. But really what I wanted to keep asking myself was, but what do these two men, especially the ideas they hold in common, what do they have to say to us now? And that's, as you've already mentioned, Dale, is the question I've been asking all along in my writing about Buddhism. How does it speak to us today? If it doesn't speak to us today, if I speak to us, I don't mean it rouses some sort of intellectual curiosity, but it speaks to us because it speaks to our condition as fallible, mortal human beings. That's the only sense I find meaningful, really, in engaging with these texts. And I find that my readings of early Pali texts, my readings of the dialogues of Plato and Xenophon and so on, are once again primarily concerned with questions which we would loosely call ethical. In other words, that both Socrates and the Buddha put metaphysics to one side very clearly, although the later traditions, of course, revived it all. But the fact is, they quite clearly had nothing really, they had no real time for these kind of abstract philosophical questions. They were interested exclusively in how to live well. For the Buddha, this manifests most explicitly in his 4 tasks, the last of which is to cultivate a way of life that incorporates the totality of our humanity. And for Socrates, his questions were primarily about what does it mean to live a good life? What are the virtues, in other words? What does justice mean? What does courage mean? What does piety mean? And so on. So that, to me, is the real common thread. And if we push that a little bit further into what kind of ethics, then it's what I would consider to be an ethics of uncertainty. In other words, an ethics that's not premised upon any kind of metaphysical axioms about the good or whatever, but one that is really about learning how to, in a way, live out your intuitive sense of what the virtues are in response to the specific situations in which you find yourself in life. In other words, both ethics are situation. I mean, this is very clear in Socrates. His dialogues are occurring with a particular person in a particular time. And likewise, the Buddhist sutras are very often presented in the forms of dialogues as well, although not nearly as rigorous and as well recorded as we find those of Plato. But there's enough material, I felt, by bringing all these threads together to be able to present these two figures side by side in a comparative way, which weirdly has never been done, which is odd enough. And at the same time, to run a third thread through the whole narrative, which keeps coming back to our own sense of who we are, of what challenges face us, of how we can understand these figures emerging from their own historical conditions, and how we can also see how they gave birth to schools of philosophy in the case of Socrates, of different Buddhist religious schools in the case of the Buddha. So it just seems to be a very rich body of material that admittedly was quite hard to pull together. And I think some of my frustrations with the book have to do with the difficulty of condensing all of that material into reasonable sized narrative.
Let me ask you to extend the theme, because the central set of ideas really exhilarating is that in the book, wherever Buddhists end up deifying Gautama, which is all over the place, of course, and wherever Socrates has been made a spokesperson for Platonic metaphysics in its first absolute certainty, then the force, the radical teachings of these two, Socrates and Buddha, and their whole lifestyle gets muted and undermined. Can you just elaborate that out a little bit?
That is certainly the case. I completely agree with you. And you could even extend that possibly even to the figure of Jesus too. You get the Gospels, and then next thing you've got the Roman Catholic Church. And there's a bit of a disconnect between what these people somehow embodied and taught and what their passions drove them to lead the kind of lives they led, can quite quickly get usurped after their death by power structures, essentially. And we see this going on with the Buddha very, very early on, probably even in the discourse of the suttas in the Pali. They recount a power struggle between Ananda and Kassapa, Mahakassapa, almost as soon as the Buddha was dead. And you can begin seeing the form the beginnings of a religion taking place already. And in the Platonic dialogues, it's also very clear. You have, take the Phaedo, for example, which is the account of Socrates' death. You have the beginning and the end, a fairly matter-of-fact account of his death. And then in the middle, there's been inserted this huge section basically about the immortality of the soul, which really has got nothing whatsoever to do with the person Socrates. And as you say, he's already been made a mouthpiece for Platonic metaphysics. And so you see the same thing going on. And this is something I've observed, particularly in Buddhism, but in other traditions and now in the Greek tradition as well. It seems to be somehow given that if you have a person of any particular stature or authority in their own person, it quite rapidly gets co-opted by followers who seek to basically, I wouldn't say monetize, but who basically seek to turn these ideas and these practices and the example of this person into the basis for some kind of other agenda, a religious agenda, a metaphysical agenda. And so I think it's revealing, see that same pattern playing itself out in the lives of these two people. But the real challenge, of course, is, well, how do we prevent that happening? Is there some sort of manner of talking or speaking or presenting things that somehow includes its own self-destruct mechanism if things get a little bit out of hand and they become institutionalized, they become the basis of authority for a hierarchy of priests or philosophers or whatever? And probably not. I think it's basically what human beings tend to do when they are given these brilliant and fresh ideas. It's a bit like that old story that Krishnamurti used to tell about God. He said God and the devil were walking down the road. And then the God said, "Oh, look, I found the truth. There's the truth." And the devil says to him, "Give it to me and I'll organize it for you," which you've probably heard. But I think it points very much to this being a kind of archetypal tendency within human beings. We want things to be organized. We want certainty. We want clarity. We want reason. And anything that somehow threatens that gets marginalized and put to one side. We don't want quirky human beings. We want saints. We want quasi-perfect individuals who somehow embody all the virtues that they speak of. And I kind of hope in our contemporary world and our much greater focus on being somehow truthful and realistic, that we might be able to overcome that tendency, but I wouldn't bank on it.
Even I had a wonderful moment reading your book, one of those light bulb moments where I think was the chapter, Who's Buddha, Who's Socrates, where I don't know how this is possible. For the first time, it occurred to me based on you laying it out so clearly that when we read about Socrates, we get his character from all kinds of perspectives, from Plato and from his biographer, so that he's more of a character, like a literary character, versus when we read about the Buddha, it was not till, hundreds of years after his death that things finally got written down. So it was all people trying to memorize verbatim exactly what he said, and it makes his, like you just said, character appear or read stiffly. And so I thought, my God, what a blessing it is that we had these wild dramatists playing and distorting and making stuff up and tearing people to pieces, all in service of telling a particular story. And so my question to you is, do you think our understanding of the Buddha and Buddhism would be vastly or wildly different had the Buddha had the similar kind of entourage of playwrights working with him?
He might have done. The trouble is we hardly have a clue as to what his secular community was like, his lay followers, as we would say in Buddhism, because the texts were basically memorized and increasingly controlled by the monastic community. And there are very good reasons. This was an organization that was set up to survive under adversity. There was a great emphasis on Sangha. You didn't have an equivalent, or as far as we know, you didn't have an equivalent body of non-monastics at the Buddha's time who could have as it were, retained their particular version of who this person was and so on. And I think that's been an enormous loss. There are hints in the Pali texts where, after the first council, where Mahakassapa has more or less laid down the law, a guy called Purana shows up, who's a monk, a student of the Buddha, and they tell Purana, okay, we've had this council now, everything that you say about what the Buddha taught, it has to accord with what we have memorized and what we have, as it were, agreed upon as being authoritative. And he said, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm only going to teach what I heard from Gautama's own mouth. And then he went on. You never hear of him again. So there clearly were dissenting views amongst the wider community. This fellow was still a monk, but it seems he was someone who was also surrounded by more lay people than monks. And I fantasized that, what if a guild of goldsmiths, for example, had taken it on board to have a certain amount of funding always set aside for a handful of people who had memorized these texts and passed them down? I think we would have ended up, if that had come through to us instead of the monastic rendering, probably with a completely different impression of who the Buddha was, and possibly a quite different emphasis on what he was saying and what he taught. And in fact, what I'm doing in this book also, which is somewhat beneath the surface, I don't declare it so clearly, is effectively to try to imagine what such a secular memory might have retained. And so when I get towards the end of the book and start talking about an alternative eightfold path, in other words, a rejigging of the standard sequence of the steps of the path, I'm effectively doing it as a thought experiment to imagine what kind of dharma might have come down that we can still see faint traces of in certain canonical texts. And how would that appear? How might that then have appeared to us had we not always had to prioritize, for lack of any alternative, the canon as preserved by monastics? So that's, again, another thesis of the book, although it's not declared completely upfront.
Yeah, it comes through pretty clearly, though, and I found it exhilarating to ponder as you're going along. So I loved your chapters on the Greek drama, on the theater. Those are so well written. And it's so interesting that Socrates himself appears in a couple of these dramas. Could you elaborate on that?
The first time in history that Socrates appears in a text is in the comedy Clouds by the dramatist, poet Aristophanes. And most of what I've read on Clouds, and most commentators today tend to think that Aristophanes is basically ridiculing Socrates. He's making fun of him. I really don't believe that anymore. I don't think that's the case at all. My sense is that Socrates is being presented a bit like Brian is presented in the life of Brian. In other words, he looks a bit like Jesus, but that's where the similarity ends. And what you have in Aristophanes' Clouds is really a kind of a counter-portrait of Socrates. In other words, the way he presents Socrates is effectively the complete opposite of everything Socrates stood for. In other words, he presents Socrates as being a kind of proto-natural scientist, running experiments to see where does the noise of a mosquito come from his nose or from his arse, for example, and stuff like that. It's a sender. And then he has Socrates basically behaving as a sophist, in other words, a professional intellectual who's a wordsmith, very clever, but basically is just in it for the money. Now, these were the two things that character the Socrates definitely was not. And there's plenty of contemporary evidence to support that. So people in the audience, or at least one hopes that at least most people in the audience, would have been aware of all of that, just as people who watched the life of Brian don't think that this is a sort of blasphemous account of Jesus, although some Christians probably did. But so it's probably a similar thing to that. And I think the more he appears in Aristophanes, and he appears in a play that's been lost by Amyipsas, I think, which was called a play called Beard, about which we only have a few fragments that I've cited in the book. And then he pops up also in Aristophanes' one of his last comedies called Frogs. And that is one of the texts that gives most authority for Socrates having been close to Euripides. Because at the end of Frogs, Aristophanes says to the character Euripides who's in the play, you should stop sitting around babbling with Socrates, which I think is quite a strong indication that these two men, Socrates and Euripides, were actually quite close. But we have the problem with comparing the Buddha to Socrates is that it's too late. We're not going to find any new texts. We're not going to find any other record of his life, or it's extraordinarily unlikely. And we have to just live with the materials we have, limited and as inadequate as they are, and work with them to the best of our abilities. And being careful, of course, not to simply read into these texts what we would like to see, although that's always a danger, I think, in engaging with these texts in terms of how they speak to you personally. We're very liable to, in a way, imagine a Socrates who's more, or a Buddha who is in a sense more like us. But I think that's simply how these traditions were. I don't think that is necessarily a problem. As I've never been a Buddhist academic, and I've never really been drawn to the idea of treating these texts in a kind of scientific objectivity, looking at them as philological objects and trying to dissect them in a sort of cold, rational way. That's always given me a certain shudder of distaste. But I do admire the work of scholars who do that work. I think it does have considerable value, and I draw on their work. But personally, I couldn't do it. Yeah, there is an entanglement between Socrates and Buddha and me and all the people who have been influential in my life, but I don't see why that should be a problem.
You point out that, interestingly, both Gautama and Socrates avoided direct involvement in politics. They have, as you point out, very contrasting views on war and on military and on fighting. And you describe both in ways that are deeply admirable, even though smart part as they could be. Could you explain that?
I think this was one of the things that I struggled with through the book, and particularly when I became aware that Socrates was actually he was a hoplite, foot soldier. And that was a very bloody business. And this was during the Peloponnesian War, which was a 27-year conflict between Athens and Sparta and its allies.
In which presumably he killed people.
There's no record of his having done so, but that would have been his job. Yes, he would have killed people. Essentially, he would have killed people. And he talks about this also in his apology, his defense speech at the end of his life, that he's been willing to give his life his city. For him, he sees it as an absolute duty to be available to defend his city. And whereas the Buddha quite deliberately, or Gautama, let's say, Gautama quite deliberately renounces any involvement in warfare, any involvement in politics, but let's just stick with warfare. And he makes it the first rule of his monastic order is you don't kill. But what I currently see there is that as a result, Buddhism does not really have an adequate way to address situations of conflict, war-type conflict at all. And I've been drawn into the current catastrophe that's happening between Israel and Gaza. And I've been working with and speaking to a number of Buddhist friends in Israel who are trying to figure out, on the one hand, they feel that they are literally under threat simply because they are Jews from Hamas and elsewhere. And on the other hand, they're Buddhists and they don't like at all what their government is doing. And yet they find themselves somehow caught in the middle. But the trouble is that Buddhism doesn't really have a way of handling war. In the end, all what it boils down to is that you should love everybody, you should be compassionate to everybody, and you should eschew any kind of violence. That's it. But that's completely inadequate. And when you look at the history of Buddhist societies, when confronted with the existential threat of, say, a foreign invasion, they behave just like anybody else. They just reach for their weapons and they fight. Even monks will, in some countries, in Japan, in Korea, for example, will be trained as militias. So in some ways, Buddhism, by not having worked out what we might call a just war theory, or even that it is war legitimate under any circumstances, by simply not having addressed that question, it means that there's very little for Buddhists to work with in addressing those matters. And I think that leaves the Buddhist community largely powerless in engaging effectively with conflicts such as those that we're experiencing in our world today. And that's troubled me to some extent. Whereas Socrates is able to uphold the same basic virtues. He's applying the same kind of rigorous critique to other forms of thinking and so on. He's clearly a man of enormous integrity, and yet he also recognizes that he has a duty as a member of his society to defend it if it comes under threat. And Buddhists do the same, but they have no real theory or view that somehow makes that behavior in accord with the needs of the society at the time. I've read recently a very good book, you might know it, Dale, called Buddhism in Chinese History by Arthur F. Wright. It's a wonderful encapsulation of the role Buddhism has played in Chinese history. And one of the sentences he uses to describe Buddhism, he says, Buddhism is politically incompetent. It's unable to actually engage in an effective way in the political life of the society. And hence that was always delegated to the Confucians or Neo-Confucians later on, or even the Taoists had Tao Te Ching is essentially a textbook for rulers to figure out how to live in accord with the Tao. Buddhism really has failed on that front. So I think I say in the end of the chapter that you cite, Krzysztof, that I'm equally drawn to the unworldliness of the Buddha, worldliness of Socrates, and I would hope perhaps that provides the frame for finding some sort of middle way between the two.
Everything you just said spoke so clearly to my real life world lived dilemma. This sense that a lot that drew me to Zen practice was this heretical imperative, for lack of a better phrase, this kind of innate and this kind of Socratic questioning, but in good faith. Not, I think, just to be a jackass and just to make trouble, but to legitimately probe and dig and try to see multiple sides. And sometimes, maybe annoyingly, right? Socrates is infamous for being annoying. Obviously, he was executed in part for that. But then when I myself attempted in my own way to ask some probing questions during the election cycle and around policies in the Sangha, it felt like the message that I got back was, don't do that, because we need to cohere as a community, and these other Zen centers are doing it this way, so that's the way we're going to do it. And I was left with a genuine question of identity. How ought I navigate the core teachings as I understand them, and this need for follow the rules, because this is what we do as a Sangha. And I wonder if you can speak to that a little bit.
It's a struggle that I've also gone through my whole life, which has been involved in Buddhist communities, is that there is this tension, perhaps an unavoidable tension, the need to have you join a community because you're looking for solidarity, commonality, common concerns, friendships. And that's a very important part of being a social animal, irrespective of whether you're a Buddhist or a Christian or a Jew or whatever. But in doing that, you inevitably are likely to compromise other values. In other words, it's the old problem of conflicting goods Isaiah Berlin speaks of. Yes, it's important to have friendship, it's very valuable, but so is personal integrity and speaking truth to power. These are also important values. Can you have both? And if so, how do you negotiate that incredibly tricky terrain? And Socrates basically would have no truck with compromise. I mean, that's what's so striking about him. He's completely uncompromising. He never makes concessions. He always sticks to where his inquiry, his testing, will take him. And I think in some ways, the Buddha probably did something very similar. The Gautama that I imagine as a more human Gautama, I think is someone also who never gave in to the pressure from kings, as far as we can see. He exhibited a similar capacity to always stick to the principle rather than to get sidetracked by minor digressions. things that were really not quite pertinent. And I suspect he was a fairly ruthless kind of person. And I think one of the things that I mentioned in the book quite early on is the fact that both of these men were denounced by democratic courts shortly before they died. It seems that in both cases they had fallen foul of the new regimes that were in place in their societies. In the case of the Buddha, the sons of the two kings who had been his sponsors. In the case of Socrates, basically the Athenian democratic community that had taken against him, probably for having perceived siding with autocrats. But I think it more likely that probably in both cases, these men were seen as troublemakers. And both died shortly after they were denounced at democratic assemblies. The Buddha probably a year or so after the denunciation, and Socrates, as we know, about a month after his trial. And that suggests to me that neither of these men were people who made other people feel comfortable. I think they were both disquieting. And I think you get that very much in Buddhism. Its critique of the self, its emphasis on impermanence and contingency and change. So many of those core teachings are effectively dismantling the notion that there is any hope of a kind of final certainty as to what you should do and how you should live. You're really forced by each situation to respond appropriately rather than to impose some kind of one-size-fits-all morality. And so in that sense, I think they're very similar. But we only have with the Buddha one version of who he was, which is as the perfectly enlightened monk. He's largely an impersonal figure in the discourses. He rarely does any hint of a distinctive character or personality come through. Whereas Socrates is displayed much more blunt, really, as a guy. And if you read Xenophon, you get a slightly different guy, but it's still a guy who you could imagine meeting on the street. But if you read a Buddhist discourse, it's very difficult to imagine bumping into the Buddha on a street. Say, oh, yes, it's him, go to him.
One compromise that I think you would agree they both did make, and that's avoidance of politics. And in the case of India, it was pretty clear that the rulers in the various parts of India said basically to the Buddhists, to the Buddha, here's the deal. We like you. We like what you're teaching. If you stick to that, we will support you. We will make things go well for you. But if you dip into politics, we're going to cause big trouble. You won't exist. And so for Buddhism to continue in India and basically throughout Asia, and in some sense, we could see this in Christianity in Europe as well, avoidance of politics. They couldn't help themselves, but it was still essential. That compromise allowed their existence to continue.
That's true. In Socrates' case, he believed that the reason he didn't, in his words, the reasons he didn't engage with politics is because his daimonion told him not.
Which is convenient.
It is convenient. But it's an inner voice, as it were, which I like to think of as perhaps a deep sense of conscience. But we also have to remember that Gautama also used to hear voices, particularly Brahma Sahampati, the god Brahma, who's the one who's sitting beneath the tree and then doesn't know quite what to do next. And then Brahma Sahampati appears in the sky before him and says, there are people out there with little dust on their eyes, blah, 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 you have to go and teach. So in other words, he too nowadays would understand that as some kind of inner voice, not literally a god appearing in the sky. So it's similar. There's quite a striking similarity there. And then, of course, the voice of Mara is also one that occurs throughout the Buddha's life. And that too is a kind of inner voice. And so that's, I think, another similarity in a way between the two of them, is that they were somehow beholden to a voice that was not of their conscious ego, but somehow arose from a deeper place within. And so perhaps that also was the voice that gave them that conscience, that intuition, that if they're going to really fulfill their vocations as thinkers and sages or whatever it might have been, they need to not get involved in forms of life that could actually derail all of that. That could be one explanation. But again, Gautama is operating very much within a tradition. None of the Indian ascetic traditions, or the Brahmin priests for that matter, were involved in politics or should be involved in politics. Whereas Socrates was exceptional, I think. His renunciation of politics seemed to be very much a personal matter. Although, as we see towards the end of the book, he does, as Athens is just about to lose the Peloponnesian War, he does take up a couple of posts in the assembly, but not to any great end, it appears. He's not very successful. But it is a question, and I think it's also a question for so many people today who are practicing Buddhism or trying to lead a good Socratic life. To what extent do we involve ourselves in the active cut and thrust of politics in our democratic societies? And I think that's very much an open question. But I do hope that the book, which does really culminate in Buddha, Socrates, and us, it really culminates in envisioning a path that ends with finding your own voice rather than becoming a perfect meditator and being in samadhi. And that is quite explicitly a voice that is willing to stand up to authority, is willing to participate in the political world. And it's very strongly influenced by the work of Hannah Arendt, who is not interested in Buddhism whatsoever, which is a good thing, I think, but did lay out a template in her 2 books of philosophical writing that I've adopted to reframe the Eightfold Path. And Arendt's approach to politics is much more hands-on. It is very much about being actively involved, particularly in small scale, what she calls town hall politics, working at the grassroots level with small groups of people, which I think is a very suggestive idea of how, as a Buddhist today, that might be the place where you could best exercise your capacities as a political, rather than, say, getting caught up in party politics we find in our respective governments in the West.
With the great theme in Hannah Arendt, because for her, it's just that's right alongside the necessity of leading a contemplative life or life of the mind.
Yeah, exactly, life of the mind, exactly.
Both of these things are balancing, checking each other, and that comes out beautifully towards the end of the book.
Oh, good. I'm glad that comes through, because that is, I think Hannah Arendt stands really, in a way, as someone who tries to resolve that conundrum between the life of the mind and the life of action. And for her, action means political action. And yeah, she does say, in fact, at one point, that political action is primarily an act of speech. It's not about climbing up on barricades. It's about the way you speak, the way you voice your values, the way you engage in debate and discussion. It's a vocal part of your life is politics. That, I think, is possibly where the book concludes, but it doesn't really give one a framework. It might give you a framework, but it certainly doesn't tell you what to do. I think that would be the great danger, is laying out some sort of political philosophy and saying, if we follow these steps. But I don't know. I'm very confused when it comes to politics. I've never been involved in politics, even at a local level. And I don't feel great about that, to be honest. If the truth be known, I've never voted in an election, which is, again, something I'm not terribly proud of, in a way. But more and more, my mind is moving towards greater interest in politics. Especially with this struggle I had to write something about Buddhism and violence. I realized that the issues that we face as a global community now require responses that are not those of national governments, but some kind of transnational entities, movements, or something like that. And I do feel that we are at a cusp, a turning point in our civilization, whereas if we don't act in some effective way together globally, we are setting the stage for incredible suffering and despair and crises and breakdown in the years to come.
On that note, Stephen, do you mind if I pile on one more potential great confusion?
No, dude.
So glad you alluded to Hannah Arendt, because I want our listeners to know that your book is actually quite wide in its scope. It's not just Socrates, but you spend time talking about the other Greek philosophers in conversation with Socrates, the Epicureans and Stoics, but you also talk about Heidegger and you also talk about Nietzsche. And so it's quite the conversation. And as you were talking about the problem of politics, I was thinking, because you allude to it quite often too, our latest existential crisis, something like global warming and or AI, take your pick, which one seems more alarming to you. But I was wondering, in this frame of the imagination as the antidote to reactivity, what might you imagine Socrates / the Buddha would say or want to say to a college 18-year-old or 20-year-old just sitting down in the classroom, and there is the AI machine that has all the answers? What might an ethics of care, to use your phrase, look like for these young minds being educated in that? Ought they read Socrates? Ought they read Plato? Ought they read Buddhist scripture? What do you say?
It's a very difficult question. It's a very difficult question to answer in the abstract. I've recently made an effort to try to spend more time with young people. We don't have children, so again, it's something else that my Buddhism has weaned me off. But I do find it quite fascinating to get to know 18 or 19-year-olds. In fact, we had a young man staying with us earlier this summer. I think these people are pretty smart. I think they're pretty resourceful. I don't think they're entirely slaves to their devices as much as they're often criticized for being. I've also noticed that movements like that of Thich Nhat Hanh, for example, who lives just up the road we live just down the road from Plum Village, they do address a much more engaged version of Buddhism to their community. And they're one of the few Buddhist movements I'm aware of today that is being loved by young people. I think that's very promising. I'm not quite sure what they tell them, but certainly they're not saying, look, if you're going to be a good Buddhist, you have to meditate a lot and you have to find solitude and quiet. And so, no, they're saying, no, the important thing for that community is to create community. And that becomes their practice, is the creation of community. And that necessarily entails speaking to one another about things that really matter for you. They're encouraging that kind of group dynamic. So I think if you think of it as that being an example, and maybe Thich Nhat Hanh being an example of, say, the Buddha for our times, I think he set up a system that actually does try to answer that question. But the core of it for Thich Nhat Hanh was very much giving more centrality in one's practice to the forming of living communities, interactive communities. What the Buddha or Socrates would say, I honestly don't know. And it's a nice sort of teasing question. I often get asked similar things like, what would the Buddha say about X or Y or Z? The problem is the Buddha and Socrates were creatures of their time as much as they were expositors of something timeless. Perhaps a more reflective approach would be to say, what are the principles by which Socrates sought to live by? What are the principles by which the Buddha sought to live by? How do they address the kind of crises that we face today? And I would always encourage young people, again, this is very much a Socratic and Buddhist thing, to always think for themselves, to become free-thinking, rational, autonomous, ethical beings. And that is the message I hope to get through in what I've written in this book. For autonomy is absolutely central. And I do think the great threat of social media and so on is that it compromises our autonomy. We become so dazed and dazzled by these media that we really lose the capacity to really think for ourselves. Everything is moving so fast, we don't have the time to think for ourselves. And yet that, I think, is catastrophic. And probably that is what most young people of that age now are suffering from. But again, there's a disconnect between my actual encounters with young people who don't seem to be just slaves to their devices, even though they use them. They seem to be much more savvy than that. And I'm very grateful to meet such kids. So that does give me a little bit of optimism. I think my job, rather than the Buddha's job or Socrates' job, is to try to outline a form of Buddhist practice and philosophy that is not standing aloof in some Asian system, but is one that's increasingly integrated with how our own Western tradition has thought and practiced over a comparable period of time, and to set the ground for a kind of dialogue, discussions that can increasingly bring people in the world together. I spent the last month in China, and that was a complete mind. And I found I wasn't at all prepared for my encounter with Chinese people. I was completely biased by the liberal Western media. And yet we worked and taught with Chinese groups in Beijing and Hong Kong. And let's just keep to mainland China. But I found these people were bright. They thought for themselves. They were very cultured. And they also were very concerned with the kind of future that they wished to help create for their children and for future generations. I was very impressed. I was not prepared to encounter that kind of person. I had this idea they'd all be looking over their shoulder at the surveillance cameras and stuff. That's a complete caricature. I think we're stuck in a kind of version of China that might have ceased to exist about 25 years.
By things that make us and the human beings in the world today, Chinese, Pakistan, Americans, Scots, French, make us distinct, are one, we now have access to all of the wisdom traditions in the world, translated into any language we want. It's all there for us. No one in the past has ever had that. We are so incredibly different in that regard. Two, second point is we have the freedom in the kind of even religious societies, for the most very secular in this, that we have the freedom to read those, to think widely, to participate in forms of culture that are quite other than our own, to eat foods that come from around the world, freedom not to be orthodox. There are still some human beings who face that pressure to be, you've got to be this kind of Muslim, or you've got to be this kind of Buddhist, whatever. But that freedom just sets us loose in a way that is extraordinary. And so that the books you write, Stephen, and your life is only possible now. Never was possible before for somebody to be like you. So that uniqueness is, I think, extraordinary and sets us off on paths that are going to go many different directions, which is good, but can't predict and know the outcomes of. It dawns on me every once in a while just how different our world is than the world we study when we study Buddhism, we study other religious traditions.
I completely agree with that. And in fact, it's something that I constantly have to remind myself of, because we take, as all periods in history do, people take their situation as given, and they fail to really adequately recognize how it has evolved in the last 100 years, let's say, in the West, from what my parents' generation experienced and what we experienced. And huge differences. And the rate of change is also accelerated in a way that's actually scary sometimes, the developments, particularly in internet technology, AI. Yeah, and I do think it's wonderful that I feel very grateful, extraordinarily grateful to have had the opportunities I've had to be able to basically have a Buddhist education as well as a Western education, to access to the world's literature, as it were. And with translation technologies and so on, that's going to be more and more the case. But at the same time, we also risk being completely overwhelmed and overloaded with too much information. And the challenge is how do we refine our understanding in which we take account and are inspired by different traditions, but are able to find a way of integrating those traditions and values in a way that is manageable, as it were, and we're not just confused by the superfluity of information. And I guess that's what my work has been about from the beginning, is to try to do that, is to try and at least begin to trace a course from my very limited perspective on how that might play itself out. And I see myself as a guinea pig, actually. I've let myself have the life I've had instead of chickening out and going to university and getting a degree and becoming an academic or something. No offense meant, of course. And it's been lonely at times too, because I don't have a body of colleagues that I could work with. There's all sorts of things I think I've missed out on. But I do feel fortunate in being able to have managed to have a way of life that's enabled me to survive. And even, I would say, to flourish, actually. I feel very grateful that I made those choices as an idealistic young 18-year-old, to become a Buddhist monk and do all this stuff, and to stick with it. It's humbling, really. And again, that's one of the things I enjoyed about going back to China and Japan recently, is being able to return something that I've learned from those traditions, from those cultures, by returning a kind of regurgitated Buddhism that I think there's actually quite an audience for in modern East Asia, particularly. They're looking for a way of making sense of Buddhism, much in the same way that we as Westerners were looking to find another sense in Buddhism for our time. And I think that's not my hunch, and I don't like predictions, is that probably the next great wave of development in Buddhism will come from East Asia. That's my sense. I think the West has had a go, and I think actually done some incredible things. But I wonder if, in a way, the next move will be to pass the baton back to the Chinese or to the Koreans or whatever. We'll see.
That would make you practitioner of Nietzsche's metaphor for himself, where he's a bridge, in a sense, your work and other people's work in global Western Buddhism shakes everything and send it and gives them a chance for a do-over. And I think you're right. They will.
That has been very much my sense, both in my recent experience in China and a couple of years ago in Japan. It's the first time I've been invited by Asian Buddhists, or as real Buddhists, to actually share my particular views. And there's an amazing interest in thinking Buddhism differently. But the big difference is that when you share these things with someone who's a Chinese or a Japanese or a Korean, it lands different. It lands in a person who they might be completely unconscious of it, but they're already formed by Buddhist beliefs in so many things. Okay. And so that's one of the reasons why I find it so fulfilling, I think, to engage with East Asian Buddhists, because they've got maybe a richer ground from which to then take some of these ideas further. And of course, I also dislike enormously this binary division between East and West Asia. I really don't like that. I think that's got to go. So in a way, I'd like to abolish all those kinds of essentially imperialist distinctions, colonial distinctions.
Stephen, I'd like to name another thread that I see running through your work, which is that of poetry, and how often we return to poetry. And in the speakers that we talked about today, whether it was poetry or drama, but Nietzsche was obsessed with poetry, wrote some himself. He was maybe the most literary of our philosophers. Heidegger's entire late philosophy was drawn towards poetry and writing it in a way that you could quite easily call poetic. And then when I think about what you did with the Four Noble Truths, and when I present in my class the logical version of truth number one is life is suffering. But then when I look at your translation, your poetic translation of from life is suffering to embrace life, to me, that's alchemy that a poet performs, not least to mention your earlier book, Verses from the Center, about Garjana's dialectics, negation, and so on and so forth in poetic form. So I think I'm just trying to name what I think is so strong about your writing and about encountering thinking, is that there's a poet's sensibility woven throughout, and it's such a needed, I would call it the antidote to technological thinking.
It's very kind of you to say that, Krzysztof, and I know what you're getting. I don't actually think of myself as a poet, because I've tried to write poetry and certainly not want it to be published. And poetry doesn't come naturally to me at all. It doesn't. I don't get verses popping into my mind. They never have. I greatly admire poets and poetry, but I do think of myself as an artist, of which a poet is a subset, as it were, and I'm quite happy with that broad term. And I do recognize that my work has been very much that the imagination has been involved in my work every bit as much as reason. And in fact, I'm a collage artist. That's what I mainly work in, is the medium I work in now. And this book and my last book were largely constructed according to the models I use for making visual collage. You'll see that both books, Art of Solitude and this, have 32 chapters. And that becomes a kind of a template, which I then, as it were, fill in. And I find that having the form, a kind of an invisible form that's in my mind, very difficult to replicate, provides me with a sort of a device to arrive at insights, if I could put them that way, that are the consequence not of my rational thinking, but because of the way I've set up the template. It's weird. It's very difficult to describe. But it's certainly these moves that I have made in, say, going from the four truths to the four tasks. My rational self would say, that's not just my invention. You go back to the Buddha's first discourse, and that's exactly what it says, which is true too. But what happens is that I think, obviously, people read the Buddha's first discourse, Turning the Wheel of Dharma. They've read it hundreds and hundreds of times, thousands. Everybody reads it, but nobody, I think, gets it. And that, I think, is where the imagination has to interrupt the purely rational investigation, which is often embedded in an interpretative scheme or an orthodoxy of some kind, however much that is in the background. But to positively value the imagination, which I do, I think is the result of my working as an artist and seeing my work as having an artistic component, or poetic, if you wish. And certainly the way this book emerged was not, I had some vision of what it would be and then I set out and write it, not at all. It evolved and mutated and changed shape, and bits got left out and bits got put in, and it grew almost organically into the form it now is. But I follow my own aesthetic intuitions as much as I follow my rational conclusions. And I've got fairly fixed ideas of a lot of what I say. But at the same time, I'm aware that the imagination, the capacity to think differently, is really what has enabled all of these books to have been written.
So, Stephen, we've gone on for a long time. You've been fabulously interesting. Thank you so much for joining us. We should close down now and let you get off to dinner in Bordeaux. But we very much enjoyed this conversation. Thank you so much for joining. We hope to have you back on Fire Philosophy again. For now, goodbye and thanks again.
Thank you very much, Dale. Thank you very much, Krzysztof. And yes, I would be quite open to doing another session at some later date. So stay in touch. Thank you.